All right, everybody. So for this week, we're talking about ideology. And part of what we're going to delve into with ideology comes out of something called the Frankfurt School. Um, we read two essays. The first is by Siegfried Krakauer, The Mass Ornament, and the other one is by Walter Benjamin, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. This brief video is just meant to help explain some of the background of what the Frankfurt School was doing and why it was doing it, as well as to provide a little overview for both of the essays that we've read for this week's class. So really what we're talking about with this mode of trying to understand and grasp ideological underpinnings of film is an aspect of critical theory, okay? This is focused on the critique of culture, capital, and in the sense of the two essays we read this week, modernism, okay? The idea is that these people are talking about come from a very specific place and time. So Krakauer, Benjamin, and then the other two major cultural theorists who come out of the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, they're very invested in trying to understand capital's relation to labor through culture. And this comes out of a Marxist system of critique. It's underpinned by Marxist theory of labor and capitalism. Okay, so before we dive into that, I just want to make note that it's important to remember that Marxism, in the way that we're talking about in this class, is a system through which we can understand history. It is a means of understanding and critiquing ideology within the systems of capital. Okay, so what we're talking about here is not kind of political party ideology, something like communism or socialist party. It is a socializing theory of cultural critique, but this is kind of the foundation for a large number of fields, including cultural studies, which is kind of where we're situated in this week's readings, gender theory, queer theory, feminist theory, critical race theory. All of this comes from elements of this kind of foundational critical theoretical approach stemming from a Marxist understanding of history through the lens of labor and capital and how culture interacts with all of that. We'll watch a little video in class on Thursday about Marxism, just to give us all a refresher of like what the main theory of labor is for Karl Marx specifically, and then how we can talk about how it relates to all of this stuff a little more in depth. But for now, just know that this is kind of where these people writing these essays this week are coming from. So what was the Frankfurt School? Well, the Frankfurt School was founded in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany. And it was an institute that was intended to bring together all kinds of different strands of Marxist theory into one interdisciplinary research center. So that, for instance, people from philosophy, from art history, from literary studies, from really all over could come together and try to think about culture and modernism. And what we really are talking about here is the rise of mass culture around the turn of the century, which was a new phenomenon, and try to understand what was happening with the world and specific nations, politically, socially, and so on. So these critiques of culture and ideology, according to the Frankfurt School, have to be underpinned by the specifics of their time and place. And here What we're talking about is a series of people who were mostly German Jews. Most of them fled Germany by the early 1930s because of the rise of fascism. And when they really started writing their biggest critiques of mass culture, they were already within a system that was changing rapidly, marching towards fascism. So they're not super um, enthusiastic about the rise of Nazism, as you might imagine. And it's important to keep in mind here, too, that, um, there's a lot of misconception and discussion that happens, particularly now, particularly on the internet, um, of this like idea that communism and Nazism are the same thing, or that the Nazis were socialist, and that's absolutely not true. These people were socialists, and they were opposing the Nazis, right? Nazism, what it really is, and the socialist part of it, is that it is a cooperative, collaborative relationship between capitalist industry and the government. Okay, it's not that the government owns the industry, right? That's a form of communism. It's that the industry and the government are in collusion with one another, and that the end goal, in the eyes of these theorists, the end goal of pure capitalist thought will always result in the rise of fascism. Okay, so they're coming from a very dark, very pessimistic place. Um, but I think through our discussion this week and through this little mini lesson here, you'll start to understand a little bit of where they were coming from. And you might even understand a few things that have resonances with today. So, Siegfried Krakauer's essay, The Mass Ornament, is actually one of his earlier essays about culture. We'll be reading him again uh, in the week on realism. But what are we talking about with the mass ornament? Well, what he's doing this essay is taking the concepts of Taylorism and Fordism, right? So the rationalization of labor and the mechanization of production. And he's saying that once these are implemented into cultural products, culture becomes flattened. It removes all nuance, it removes the individual, the creativity. Okay. So if we think about what we're talking about, right? Henry Ford is where Fordism comes from. Ford trucks off the assembly line, right? This is a rational uh, product of labor in the age of mechanization. Okay. So each worker in the Ford factory has its little widget that it has to put together. Its little piece of the engine, its little piece of the door. That's it. Okay. They are not creating, each person in there is not creating a Ford pickup truck. Okay. They're only creating the part. Now, if we're thinking about Marx's theory of labor and alienation, what this means is that those workers never see themselves in direct relation to the actual fruits of their labor, which is the end goal of the Ford truck, right? So that's why he's looking at this stuff. Now, what does this have to do with mass culture? Well, there's this idea that because in the modern era, they're encountering kind of this new wave of entertainment, okay, where mechanical processes play a key role in people's leisure time. All right. Now, this comes more so out of Adorno and Horkheimer's work than Krakauer, but this is also part of what he's getting at. People clock in, they clock out at the factory. They go on to watch a movie. Okay. The movie is broken down into different run times, and you can go see different movies at different show times. 6 o'clock is dinner, 7 o'clock movie, 2 hours later, you're back at home doing whatever. In your leisure time, if you have participated in seeing a movie, whether it's, or even like going to a theme park, okay, what you have done with your free time is generate further capital for the system that has paid you for labor that you do not get to enjoy because you do not have a Ford truck that you built, right? And if you want one, you have to then purchase it from the factory at which you work, okay? So it's all about like how leisure time is further regimented into clock in, clock out that also generates revenue. It's not just you wandering about the sun, around the countryside in the sun or going on hikes. It's all about turning culture into a commodity that further generates value upward. Okay. Now, what Krakauer is getting at when he's talking about the mass ornament is he's talking about how the individual becomes removed from their own leisure and their own pleasure and from culture itself. And what is replaced is a mass, an unidentifiable mass. Okay. I'll come back to this point in just a second, right? But basically, the idea is that we are unaware of our own position within mass culture, okay? As consumers, as people who are being fed dominant ideological strains through our intake of media, through the capitalist system itself. And so because of that, we only exist within structures of mass culture, which are structured by capital interests. Okay. So let's look at a concrete example that he actually talks about in his essay. Okay. This is footage of the Tiller Girls. Now, this is the Tiller Girls a little later than when he's writing this essay. They became kind of a franchised entertainment thing. So like there were the Tiller Girls in the UK and so on and so forth. So, but that's also part of what Krakauer would be getting at here, right? Is that you don't know any of these girls' names. You only know this, but also, well, we'll come back to it. Let's watch the clip. Okay, so what's clear about the Tiller Girls example, right, is that you cannot make out the individual in there, and the individual is not important. Okay, what makes the Tiller Girls entertaining or interesting is the fact that it is many people doing the same thing in a very mechanized way, right? In this extremely highly choreographed way, almost like they are themselves a machine, right? So if you're thinking about the way that um, somebody like Siegfried Krakauer is coming to this understanding of what mass culture is doing to us, right? Not only is it commoditizing our time and creating cultural products that themselves are only commodity, it is training us, right? And this is the ideological part of it, training us to be a part of that same system and to want to be a part of that same system because our entertainment is our leisure and our leisure feeds back into that. Okay. Now, what does this have to do with ideological constructs? Okay. Well, the idea here is that because in a mass culture society, people with lots of money have more power and more control over what is deemed culturally relevant or valuable and the types of art and cultural experiences which are produced for consumption, that their dominant ideological construct will be passed through to us, the consumers, the audience, the fun havers, right? Vis-a-vis the cultural product. And since everything within that cultural product is commodified in some way and loops us back into a system of feeding capital upwards, spending money, and regimenting our time off as if we were at work. And because we're generating capital for the top, we technically are working for them. This becomes a problem. Okay. Now we'll talk more about Krakauer in our synchronous session. I know that you'll probably have more questions. I'll have more examples to talk with you about. But when you're watching this week's film, if you haven't watched it already by this point, 42nd Street, think about how that movie is feeding you dominant strains of ideology. Okay. Think about how it is um, telling you about capital. Think about how it's telling you about what entertainment or what art is supposed to be. Now, it's also important to realize that there are always kind of pushbacks within cultural products, sometimes even, that are purely on the part of the receiver, right? So when we deal with further iterations of cultural studies, right, we will get to a point of being able to talk about non-dominant readings or how non-dominant ideologies find their ways into cultural products for people who are receptive to those non-dominant ideologies to notice them. Okay. This is not like conspiracy or coding or any, it is coding, but it's not like trying to keep people out of the loop, or it's not doing anything nefarious necessarily. But when we talk about queer studies and African American and Black and critical race studies toward the end of the semester, you'll see all of this start to pop up more and more, especially when we get to somebody like James Baldwin, who kind of brings all of this stuff together into a book. Okay, so to wrap up, let's also work through Walter Benjamin. Okay, I know that this is a very complex essay, but I want to hit the key points and just kind of explain them, and we can talk at length about it during our Zoom session. Okay, so the big idea here right, is that according to Benjamin, a work of art has something that he calls an aura, and the aura is tied to its authenticity. Okay. So if we think of something like the Mona Lisa, okay, this is a prime example of what he's talking about. If we're talking about the Mona Lisa and you go and you see the Mona Lisa, that is a significant cultural moment for you to encounter that individual distinct work of art, right? Yet if I walk into a dorm room where someone has a poster of the Mona Lisa on their wall, that does not create the same experience for me, even though it is literally the same. It's a facsimile, right? It's literally the same image, possibly the same dimensions, although the Mona Lisa painting is quite small, so posters tend to be blown up. But I do not regard the poster as if I am interpreting the work of art right in front of my eyes, right? So when a work of art is reproduced in massive numbers, right, that aura is removed from the work of art. Okay. And this is what happens when that aura is removed. That's what Benjamin is trying to understand. And the reason he's trying to understand this, what we're about to talk about, is that he wants to come up with a way for us to move forward in an age where art is mechanically reproduced, in a society where mass culture objects are effectively our artistic uh, outputs in most of the art that we interact with, right? How can we move forward in such a society and actually start to understand what it is the work of art is about or is doing? So he's all about coming up with avenues within which to investigate and critique art in a modern world. Okay. So, what he's getting at is that the mass reproduction of art reduces its value as a cultural and political object. Okay. Transforming it into a commodity to be bought and sold. And what's important about this is that anyone who has encountered a work of art can tell you that there are distinct qualities to the work that are not actually reproduced in a facsimile, right? The texture of paint. Okay. There's also, because of the closeness of the audience to the singular work of art, right? The intimacy of theater, for example, right? There's something that's kind of give and take between that work of art and the audience or the viewer or the observer. Okay. The work of art is usually produced with some form of cultural and political intent that is also transmuted through the person who is viewing it. Okay. So we produce works of art with cultural and political intent, and we receive works of art with cultural and political intent. But what he's saying here is that since the experience of the art in a mass reproduction system is no longer specific in context of the time, space, and location, we do not consider when we watch or observe or listen to that work of art, we do not actually consider those specifics when we regard the work. Okay. So, what does this mean? What is he saying here? Okay. He's basically saying that unless you are aware or made aware of the fact of the work of art's reproduction, that you're not really thinking about it or what that implies. And because mass culture is a culture predicated on mass reproduction. So everybody who goes to see Tenet or everybody who watches Mulan on Disney Plus, they're watching the same movie. It's no different here in Atlanta as it is in California or in Berlin or in Canada or even China. There might be, slight differences, depending on censorships, things like that, but it's the same movie, okay? That does not change our interpretation of it. We do not have the same relationship with a film like that than if we were to see something that there was only one copy of, that we had to track down, that we had to watch in a basement or in an art space, right? He's talking about how this removes these considerations from us. And the implications of this are very significant for Benjamin, right? So that art is no longer valued as art, as a statement. It becomes commodified by capitalist theories of labor and consumption, right? We see the reproduction, we want to purchase the reproduction. It also functions to shift the way in which we think about the artistic process itself, right? So another way of thinking about this might be, and this is not to slight any of this necessarily, although I'll give you my opinion whenever we talk if you want to, but the idea that filmmakers have to do what you, the audience, want because you are a fan of the material, right? This is what Benjamin's talking about. You don't care about the art. You don't care about the art of creation. You don't care about considering the actual politics of anything. What you care about is you view yourself as consumer, you view them as producer, and therefore that informs the entire relationship as you understand it. Now that can be good or bad depending on, how level-headed or whatever else other contexts might be in there, right? But because you think of yourself as the customer and them as the person who serves you, the customer, you are buying into a system which treats art purely as cash flow revenue. And when you do that, it robs the work of art of its power, of any meaningful politics that might be fomented out of it. And it leads to, furthermore, and most dangerously for Benjamin and the rest of the people associated with kind of the Frankfurt School of Theory, an aesthetization of politics. Okay? So politics becomes about the image, right? We care about what candidates look like or what they have said in relation to something that does not actually matter to policy, right? And that masks the underlying ideology. This is exactly what, in relation to Krakauer's mass ornament, he was talking about, right? The ideology is masked by the aesthetics. And when mass culture becomes a part of the aestheticization of politics, what this allows for is that we have political expression, but without the recognition of fundamental human rights and even reality. Okay? So we have politics, but because we think about politics purely in aesthetic terms and also as entertainment or as meaningless ultimately as a soccer match or a football game, where all that matters is numbers tallying up, and we don't care about this is what these people actually believe versus this is what these people actually believe and how they're going to implement those beliefs and what those have to do with me, right? That this whole system ends up masking ideology. And we need to, because this is the world we're living in now, right? And this is kind of Benjamin's big point. We need to figure out avenues of interpreting that art in an age when it is purposefully being ideology is purposefully being masked by mass culture. Okay. Now, I hope that has made sense. We'll talk more about it on Thursday. Until then, I hope you have a good week, and we'll just talk about this. I'll bring more examples to class.